Welcome to week 5, and I hope you are doing well so far. We have completed 4 chapters, 4 weeks, and 2 occasions of discussion questions, and I'm hoping to continue to get you some feedback on that as well. In the 5th week, we have a little bit of a breather. The chapter is not very long, and I have one essay for you to read about the 97 floods, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this video. But this week, in addition to reading about uncertainty and understanding the critical role that uncertainty plays as part of the big picture in studying crisis communication, I hope you also take this opportunity this week now to begin seriously thinking about what you're going to do for your paper assignment and what kind of crisis you'd like to research, and start working on that project. Identify the particular crisis you'd like to do a paper on and start looking for sources and doing the research necessary to complete the assignment. I'm available in any way you need help. If you want me to help you narrow down a topic or the angle you want to take to that topic, I can help you with the research end. And I'm always happy to look at an outline or draft of papers as well. But you need to be able to do that a bit in advance. So now that you've got a feel for some of the theory, and you've seen a few case studies, and you've read some examples of evaluation of crises, it's time for you to jump in and start thinking about what project you would like to do for your final project in the course. So that's part of your assignment this week. So this week is chapter 5, and the big focus for this chapter is a concept that is really critical to the study of crisis communication, and that is the idea of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a byproduct of every crisis, and it's also part of life, but it takes on particular importance and dimensions when it comes to a crisis situation. The authors define uncertainty as the inability to determine the present or predict the future. And the idea of crisis is that because it's an unusual situation, it comes out of nowhere, unexpected, that the traditional means of responding to situations changes. You can't use routine situations. There's fear involved. There's a lack of information often involved. The uncertainty that surrounds a crisis is a major part of how audiences process them. It's also an important component about how people try to solve those crises. And it's that uncertainty that often drives both behavior as well as thinking on the parts of audiences in certain ways that can be damaging. Uncertainty is also an opportunity, and we'll talk about that as well. But essentially, one of the things that the uncertainty concept has taught us about crisis is this idea that both a crisis is a real situation but also an issue of perception. The public is not really good sometimes at discerning the difference between risk and reality, or perception and the actual danger they might be facing. So, for example, if there's a plane crash, people will tend not to want to fly, even though flying is still a much safer mode of transportation than, let's say, driving. Or an act of terrorism like the 9/11 attacks are certainly serious and damaging and deadly, but the number of attacks and serious terrorist attacks the United States has weathered has been really quite few. Terrorism is something that perceptually is very threatening to people, and it creates uncertainty about safety and cities and flying and other situations. But the reality of it, the odds of it, are actually pretty small. And so one of the things that we learn from crisis situations and experiences, there's the reality of the situation, but there's also people's perception of the dangers and what is happening. Sometimes people's perceptions will overstate the dangers. They will panic. They will respond in irrational ways, even though the situation is not as significant as they might think it is. On the other hand, there are some people who will kind of deny, who will hide, who will minimize the danger of a situation and actually engage in behavior that's dangerous as well, because they're not willing to take responsibility for the situation. They'll maybe deny the uncertainty surrounding a set of environments. So when we look at uncertainty as a concept in this chapter, also remember very strongly the idea of perception. And so this is why communication in crisis situations is so important, because people need to be reassured, they need messages, they need content, they need things to do. And sometimes we know so much about a crisis situation that we tend to minimize it, or at least we can put it into perspective, but audiences cannot. And so that uncertainty and that perception and that concept of threat impacts them in ways that we don't often anticipate. So sometimes crisis communicators fail to think about audience perception, and as a result, they don't adequately respond to a crisis for an audience. Let's look at some of the lessons. This chapter is basically a set of lessons about crisis, and I'll let you read the examples and sort of the many cases they talk about. But think about how the lessons of crisis connected to uncertainty also connect to the basic definition that we have of a crisis. When a crisis unfolds, okay, it happens quickly, unexpectedly. People don't have time to think about what to do and respond. They're often acting spontaneously. They're acting without complete knowledge. That uncertainty then leads to people to question their actions or their motives or their options, and that creates a great deal of unsettledness and uncertainty. The idea that we should not respond to a crisis with routine solutions is really critical. Because of the nature of a crisis, we need sometimes to think outside the box, go farther than we normally would, and again, not try to treat a crisis as if it's just another run-of-the-mill situation. Because, though, we are responding with non-routine situations and in ways that are more creative, that is creating uncertainty. Routine, process, structure lends itself to certainty. When we start going outside the box, when we start responding in ways we aren't prepared to respond to, that tends to magnify the uncertainty we feel. We've already talked about threat as perceptual, so we need to get in the heads of people. Crisis communication is in part thinking about what does the audience know, how did they feel, how are their perceptions playing a role. There's a lot to the psychology of crisis communication that we have to incorporate, and we have to think more carefully about what certain audiences are going to do and how they're going to react. In crisis communication, we must communicate early and often. People need reassurance. The hard part about crisis situations is we rarely have all the information we need quickly. There are holes to be filled, there are details we don't know. But the best literature in crisis indicates that the faster you can get a message out there, provide at least some explanation. Communicate early enough so that people know that you're responding and you're working on it, that you're open to providing them as much information as possible, as soon as possible, helps to reassure them that you are responding to a crisis well. People will look for information. If you can't provide them the information, they'll look elsewhere. They'll go to rumors, they'll go to Facebook, they'll go to Twitter. They'll latch on to anyone who can give them some kind of answer, even if that answer is outrageous or wrong. The first 4 lessons in this chapter on crisis and uncertainty are focusing and reminding us about what is happening immediately upon a crisis occurring. How do people act and respond? What do they need to know? And how quickly do they need to know it? Recently, there was an accidental warning in Hawaii about a possible nuclear missile attack, and for 30-some minutes, people were pretty panicked because they thought there was a possibility of a missile attack. Now, it turned out to be an accident. It turned out to be someone pushed the wrong button. And it took, however, I think it was 38 minutes for them to correct that problem. Think about how people were thinking and feeling in that half an hour. They were scared. They were concerned. They knew we were, engaged in issues with North Korea. They didn't know how they should respond, where they should go. Some people took shelter. Some people kept playing golf. Everyone treated that situation in slightly different ways. So depending on people's perceptions, some people panicked, others did not. Others didn't believe it. There's a lot of interesting kind of ways to look at the public's response to that fake warning to help understand why people's perception of a crisis is going to change or differ from person to person, and why people's uncertainty will lead to behaviors and could lead to actions that maybe are good but also could be harmful and dangerous to people. The fact that it took more than half an hour to clarify that message and correct it shows that it took far too long, and they didn't do a very good job of notifying the public quickly enough. So people in the United States found out about this, and we heard about the warning before they had a solution to it and an answer. So even that fake nuclear weapon or nuclear missile warning demonstrates to us the uncertainty that can be created even when a crisis isn't necessarily happening, but there's the perception or belief that a crisis might be occurring. The other 6 lessons in this chapter are focusing on things that might not only be immediate, but also might be more in the future. So thinking about, for example, that we need to have consistent messaging in a crisis. One of the problems is that sometimes there are too many voices. And so ambiguity becomes an issue. Who do we believe? Which spokesperson do we believe? The BP oil spill we saw last chapter was a good example of a problem with that crisis, because there were so many agencies speaking about the oil spill that it was difficult for some audiences and some people to discern who to believe. Who do you take more seriously? Who's in charge? Who's got the best solution? So we should try to avoid so many different interpretations. The best literature says organizations should centralize their response, choose someone to serve as a spokesperson, and run things all through that office, and run things all through that source of information. So don't let all of your employees just talk to the press. Don't let everyone, just kind of randomly give information. Keep an eye on Twitter and social media feeds where other information coming out might not be as accurate, and try and control that as best you can. Be prepared to defend your interpretation of the evidence surrounding a crisis. Again, it's often incomplete. You don't want to make claims that you can't back up in the future. So a little bit of what your textbook calls ambiguity is important. Recognizing that, you're working on the best information possible, but it may not be enough. So be prepared to at least defend what you know and when you know it. Your textbook talks a lot about good intentions before a crisis occurs. It is really useful for organizations to do a lot of good groundwork, get to know their audiences, the press, their community. The Malden Mills example you read about last chapter, one of the things that made Malden Mills such a successful crisis management process was that he had a wonderful relationship with his community ahead of time. And you saw that in that case study, and probably read it in the journal article you had to read there as well. Obviously, because of uncertainty, people have lots of questions, and your textbook has a great list of questions people will ask. Explain who is responsible. How did it happen? Train people to be prepared for a crisis. Most organizations have both a crisis plan in place and they practice it. Here at UNI, they rehearse their crisis plan every summer in multiple ways. Many organizations do. Think about where you work or where you've worked in the past. Do they have a plan? Do they rehearse it? Do they practice it? All the schools here in this district practice evacuations and active shooting drills. They all have crisis plans in their classrooms. Teachers are trained. To help reduce uncertainty means, in part, preparing people so they know what to do, so they have an answer. Where do I go? What do I say? How do I respond? Where do I hide? What are my responsibilities? Training helps to reduce that uncertainty because it gives people an understanding of what they should do and what their responsibilities are. So a crisis is going to challenge an organization in a lot of different ways. And so the uncertainty principle in this chapter really helps you to focus on why a crisis can change the way an organization thinks. Now, in addition to this brief chapter, you have a journal article about chaos theory. Chaos theory discusses sort of the idea of how the multitude of interactions create sometimes unintended consequences. This article is based on the 1997 floods in Fargo, North Dakota and Grand Forks, North Dakota that led to a significant amount of damage. Now, I lived in Fargo in 97 and I was a part of that crisis. So reading this article was really important to me. One of the most important challenges we faced when we were in that crisis is not knowing what to do because the information we received was not always accurate, was not always well presented. And so this uncertainty of water levels and flooding and so forth led to a lot of frustration and also mistakes. That article is a really good example of showing you just how complicated a crisis can get and how many different voices can occur, and how that complication and uncertainty can lead to audiences' dissatisfaction, bad decision making, and concerns about how a crisis is being handled. So read that as well, and it gives you a really good example of some of the dynamics that this uncertainty concept in this chapter presents to you. So this week you're learning about uncertainty. You're learning about people's perceptions of a crisis. You're learning about how those variables come together to create, even in a mathematical setting or model, what we call chaos. Hopefully this week now you're going to start picking your case study. Think about what chapter, what crisis you want to study. Begin doing some research. I'll be happy to help you with that, but get started on it sooner than later. Next week then we'll have another discussion set of questions, and we'll move forward with some new concepts. Have a good week. Contact me with questions. Keep up the work. Stay current. And we'll get through this course, and you'll learn a lot more about crisis to come. Thank you.